Chapter 7, Expansion and Division, Part 4, James Polk and the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848. The 1844 elections. Clay versus Polk versus Birney. In the 1844 elections, the Whig nominee Clay found himself up against the Democrat, Tennessean, James Polk. President Van Buren had alienated so many within his own Democratic Party that the party's presidential nomination ultimately went to Polk, something of a dark horse that had not been one of the early frontrunners in the party. Polk subsequently ran his campaign on the promise that if elected, he would admit both Texas and Oregon as new states, thus offsetting some of the northern opposition to the admission of Texas as a slave state. Clay, his third time as a presidential candidate, ran on the typical Whig platform of Clay's own American system: protective tariffs to promote American industry, a strong central bank, the building of the commercial infrastructure of canals and roads. These all tended to favor the conservative interests of up-east financial industrial class and undercut his support among Westerners and Southerners. But a third party, the Liberal Party spoiler, James Birney, was also running, drawing support away from those who would otherwise have voted for Clay. This would prove ruinous for Clay. Polk victorious. So it was that Polk handily won the electoral vote, including even a large number of northern states. The admission of Texas to the Union. But as a lame duck president, Tyler, sensing that the election had served as a referendum strongly supporting of the admission of Texas as a new state, moved ahead in his last days as office as president and proposed to Congress a resolution opening Texas to membership in the Union. This was the final blow in undercutting his Whig political base, causing the president to be expelled from his own Whig party. The Whigs fought the annexation with all the strength they could muster. John Quincy Adams, who was a strong anti-slavery voice in the House of Representatives, had fought bitterly the admission of Texas as a new slave state, voicing this move as being a devastating calamity for the Union. But like the Federalists before them, the Whigs were up against a growing manifest destiny fever which seized the country. Remembering the fate of the Federalists, they had to voice their opposition carefully. But Whig opposition would not be enough to stop the entrance into the Union of another quite large slave state. Ultimately, Tyler succeeded in getting Congress to authorize the annexation of Texas, not by a treaty requiring a two-thirds vote for the Senate approval, which would not be possible due to the strong Whig opposition, but instead by a mere joint resolution of both houses of Congress, which required only a simple majority in both houses. Finally, the resolution providing for the annexation of Texas was signed into law by Tyler on his last day in office. And his presidential successor, James Polk, would see the annexation completed when the huge slave state Texas formally accepted the invitation to join the United States in December of 1845 as its 28th state. The Mexican-American War. Mexico had made it clear that it would never accept the loss of its Texas province, particularly if it were then absorbed into the United States. Then, when the discussions between the Republic of Texas and the United States started referencing as Texas's southern border with Mexico, not the Nueces River, but the Rio Grande, much further south and thus deeper into Mexico, the Mexicans were outraged. War clouds darken. In many ways, the new president, James Polk, was something of another Andrew Jackson, a strong president who was unafraid of stepping on toes in order to get done exactly what he wanted. He also knew that Mexico was furious enough over the admission of Texas to the Union that war could easily develop between the two nations. He was prepared for that possibility as well. But also Polk was by every instinct a lawyer who believed that it was better to work out a deal with litigants than go to court. By those same instincts, he was hoping he could work out a deal with Mexico, perhaps purchase his way to a settlement. He was prepared to offer Mexico millions in assistance and even in purchase of Western territory itself. He knew, of course, that the Mexicans themselves were fired up for war and wanted satisfaction for their bruised sense of honor. Money would not restore that sense of honor. Americans themselves were also getting fired up for the war. Thus, war was likely. But Polk wanted to make sure that if and when it occurred, it would take place on America's terms, not Mexico's. The situation was complicated further by the fact that relations between the Americans and the British were not quite resolved in the far west. England claimed Canadian territory along the Pacific coast deep into the Oregon region. There were rumors circulating that Britain was interested even in extending their imperial hold all the way into California, and were thinking about purchasing sparsely inhabited California from Mexico. The Mexicans were possibly considering this as preferable to having as northern neighbors more Americans, who also were eyeing that land. Thus, some kind of Mexican-English relationship was possibly building, which would have weakened the American hand considerably in any war with Mexico. Furthermore, though humiliated in the Texas War of Independence, the Mexican military was considered to be no joke of an army. European military experts, in fact, expected that in any direct military confrontation with America, the Mexican army, huge and well-disciplined, would make quick work of the motley crew of American militia and the rather small national army. Indeed, many were certain that the superior Mexican army would, in short order, roll back the Americans all the way to Washington, D.C. Seeing the war clouds darken, in mid-1845, Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor to move American troops into Texas and position them on the Nueces River, waiting to see what might develop. He also sent a small military group of about 60 men, of explorers, under General Fremont to Oregon through California, which was at that point still part of Mexico, whose larger purpose was a mystery to the Mexicans, and who, highly suspicious of Fremont, ordered him out of California. Then, in early 1846, Polk sent an offer to Mexico to purchase California and New Mexico. He also, in April, ordered an American warship to move into the San Francisco Bay to protect Americans living in California. Meanwhile, Mexico itself was undergoing tremendous political turmoil. 4 different individuals succeeding each other in the Mexican presidency in 1846 alone, 6 in the War Ministry and 16 in the Finance Ministry. A big part of the problem was that the Mexican leaders themselves could not agree on what to do in the face of the growing possibility of war with America. Centralists demanded war. Federalists requested negotiations. Back and forth the controversy swayed until the military party of Centralists seemed to have grabbed firm control. War is declared May 11, 1846. Polk then ordered General Taylor to move his troops all the way to the Rio Grande, where Taylor constructed a fort. For the Mexicans, this was the final insult, for they still claimed the land south of the Nueces River and north of the Rio Grande as theirs. In late April of 1846, they issued a declaration of intent to fight a defensive war and sent a detachment of 2,000 Mexican soldiers to expel the Americans from what they considered Mexican territory. In the process, the Mexicans overwhelmed a small patrol of 70 American soldiers in the disputed territory, killing 16 of the Americans. On May the 11th, claiming that Mexico had killed American soldiers on American soil, for that was what the American view on the territorial boundary was. Polk asked Congress for a declaration of war. The Democrat-dominated Congress obliged him with a declaration of war, though the Whigs, seeing this as playing to the advantage of the southern slave states, were highly opposed to this decision. At the Rio Grande. Action in Texas actually took place even before the American declaration of war. Mexican and American armies had met at the Rio Grande early in May, and the results were disastrous for the Mexicans. From then on, the southern front in the war would be fought in Mexico, not Texas. California. California was next to become the scene of battle. In June of 1846, Fremont returned to California to openly invite a revolt, a so-called Bear Flag Revolt, of Americans in Sonoma, that is, Northern California. This all looked quite similar in character to the Texas Rebellion 10 years earlier, except that the Californians moved immediately to replace the California Bear flag with the American flag. Fremont's army moved south to capture Los Angeles and was joined by way of an American general, Stephen Kearny, moving in from the east across the vast southwest desert, who easily took San Diego. By January of the following year, 1847, the Mexicans were forced to surrender their claim to California. England, meanwhile, had elected to stay out of the conflict. Taylor into Mexico. In the meantime, Taylor began to advance his troops into Mexico from the northeast. His troops were a wild collection of volunteers, undisciplined, and at times functioning more like a drunken mob than an army, raping and pillaging as they went. It took considerable effort for Taylor to finally be able to shape his gringos into a disciplined army. Footnote: there's some dispute about the origins of the term gringo. Some claim that it originated from a song that the Americans sang, Gringo the Lilacs, as they marched through Mexico. Taylor's first major encounter with the Mexicans was at the city of Monterrey, where his army, unused to urban warfare, ran into stiff resistance from Monterrey's troops and citizens. Ultimately, to achieve a win, Taylor had to resort to an armistice, allowing the Mexican soldiers to leave the city peacefully. Technically, this marked an American victory, but Polk was furious about such a weak showing on the part of Taylor. Meanwhile, Santa Anna had again seized control of the Mexican government and had come out to fight the Americans. In February of 1847, Taylor's and Santa Anna's armies met at Buena Vista, with the Mexican army over 3 times the size of the American army. Santa Anna was able to surround Taylor's troops and inflict huge casualties on them, though the Americans held their position. Both sides were exhausted, but Santa Anna got news of political troubles back in Mexico City and had to abandon the conflict, leaving Taylor in control. Footnote: Taylor would make much of this victory in his successful bid for the U.S. presidency in 1848. During all of this confusion, the Comanche and Apache Indians had been conducting raids on the Mexicans, and as American soldiers advanced from the northwest towards Mexico City, they found the countryside deserted and the towns unwilling to resist the advancing Americans. At the same time, Americans under Naval Commander Matthew Perry were also fighting the Mexicans along the Mexican shores and tributary rivers of the Gulf of Mexico, inflicting humiliating defeats on the Mexicans as they went. The capture of Mexico City, September 1847. Polk now turned to General Winfield Scott, working closely with Perry, to lead an assault in March of 1847 on the coastal town of Veracruz to reduce the walls protecting the city in preparation for a massive amphibious landing of American troops whose ultimate destination would be Mexico City. Seriously outnumbered by this attacking American force, the Mexicans were only able to hold out a dozen days before having to surrender Veracruz to their American attackers. The Americans then headed to Mexico City, and after overcoming stiff resistance to the north of the city at Chapultepec, including the brave fighting of the Mexican students at the military academy located there, were able to enter the city in mid-September. Santa Anna was overthrown and fled the country. The Americans were now in total control of the Mexican political heartland. Footnote 5. Marines were put on guard duty at the Mexican National Palace, the Halls of Montezuma, completing the opening line of the Marines' hymn, "From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli," that is, from Mexico City to the shores of the Barbary pirates. The question then arose, what to do with Mexico? Some political voices speculated that the Mexicans themselves might greet annexation to the United States gladly. The Whigs, however, were strongly opposed to the annexation of Mexican territory, fearing it would only expand the political weight of the pro-slavery portion of the nation. But in fact, neither the Mexicans nor most Americans had any interest themselves in such an action. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. In January of 1848, negotiations got underway at the town of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and within a month the two sides agreed on terms. Mexico would receive $15 million in payment from America for the acquisition of California, Texas to the Rio Grande, and the territory in between, which would eventually become New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah. The size of the financial award offered to Mexico for the loss of its territory caused some to question exactly who it was that had won and who had exactly lost the war. But it was a wise move, giving some degree of fairness to the war's outcome, for Mexico might otherwise have continued to harbor a deep resentment over a total loss, such that Mexico would have been tempted to renew the war at a time when America was less able to fight, as would be the case when America fell into its bloody civil war 13 years later.